Today's focus is on documented, repeatable processes. I'm your host, Nick Cavalancia with Techvangelism, and just to kind of start off the conversation today, I thought I'd start with the notions, a couple of things I was thinking about today. The key to any MSP growing into a successful business requires kind of two things that very much overlap: consistency and predictability. Now, you think about it for a second here. As you grow from, let's say, just you, to adding on to even just one more employee, and then 2, and then 5, and 10, and so on, as we hope we'll all grow that way. You need to know what to expect from those employees, because you don't have to expect from yourself. What to expect from those employees so that you can begin to predict. I mean, there's that word again. Basically be able to predict how long things will take, how much revenue you're going to make, and so on. And that's really the idea. And so the question becomes, how do managed service business masters create an environment? I don't just mean a network environment, I mean a business environment. How do they create that kind of an environment that revolves around documented, repeatable processes? You can create that consistency and that predictability. So in this final webinar in a 6-part series that we've done over the last 6 weeks about the habits of managed service business masters, I'm joined by Emma Finch and Scott Parker from SolarWinds, and we're going to discuss today the need for documented, repeatable processes, how to define them, what should be documented, and more. So let's start by me just covering a couple of quick housekeeping details that I want to make sure you know. We're going to try to keep this to 30 minutes as best we possibly can. Sometimes the conversation gets going a lot, especially when you guys participate in the process and you're providing some commentary, some questions throughout, that kind of thing. So we try to stick to 30 minutes. I think over the last 6 weeks, the longest one we had was about 45, maybe 50 minutes. And so we might go over a little bit long, but we are trying to respect your time. So we try to keep them around 30, but they might go over. We'll just see what happens today. The questions, please put those in the Q&A box at any point in time. We're going to make sure that we try to interact with you during our presentation. So if you've got questions, comments, any kind of anecdotes, I mean, something that you'd like to submit in and have be part of the conversation, put that in there. We'd love to make sure that you're part of this. And then we are recording this webcast, and the slides and the recording will be sent to you via email after the webinar, sometime, maybe not today, but certainly this week. So let's do this. Before we get started, I've already introduced myself a little bit, Nick Cavalancia with Techvangelism. In a former life, I owned what would be the precursor to an MSP. We didn't have all the tools that we have today, but it certainly had the same kind of business model. A lot of small businesses trying to create consistent environments, trying to create repeatable processes over a number of small and medium-sized businesses. I've also owned an enterprise consulting company where we focused on doing, mostly it was around Active Directory and Exchange designs for companies like Fox News and Brock's Candy and Hummer and Carnival Cruise Lines and the Chicago Tribune, and the list goes on and on and on. And today in Techvangelism, the company that I own today, focus on helping both customers, helping MSPs, helping tech companies as well with sort of getting their message out, understanding how to properly market and evangelize their solutions. So that's kind of what I focus on today. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to first start by welcoming Emma Finch. So Emma, welcome to today's webcast. I'm glad you've joined me.
Yeah, happy to be here, Nick. Go ahead.
Would you mind giving the audience a quick intro on you as well, please?
Sure. So I'm product marketing manager at SolarWinds MSP. So I work on our MSP RMM platform, just doing all the product marketing for it.
Wonderful. I'm also joined by Scott Parker. Scott, you and I have done one of these before. I'm glad to have you back. Thanks for joining me.
Hey there, Nick. Yeah, great to be here again as well. And I've given my bio once before, but I'll give you a quick rundown again. So I came through I came through a service delivery background. So I worked with HP, managing a 70-person help desk for a while. I worked my way through a service delivery manager position for a large MSP for years, where we rebuilt most of their collateral, their SLAs, and everything else top to bottom. And then I came in through the SolarWinds world, and I was a sales engineer for a while, helping people get onboarded with our Essential product and our RMM products. And I moved up through the PM world, developing bits and pieces of it, and now I work side by side here with Emma in product marketing.
Wonderful. Glad to have you both. Thank you, guys. So what we're going to do today, guys, it's a little bit of a different type of style of webcast. You guys using the audience, instead of it just being death by PowerPoint and we've got 27 slides ready for it, we don't. We have 3 slides. And this is more about a conversation, one that the three of us are going to have, but we'd love for you to participate in as well. So make sure you kind of join in as much as you can. We've just got a couple of slides. I want to really have a chance here to get you to focus in on the problem of documented repeatable processes and how you should think about approaching that problem in an effort to elevate your thinking about that. And that way, when you go back and try to figure out how to make changes to your own business, you've had a chance to really stop and think about that. So that's really the focus today. So let's start by just talking about the fact that success is found, as you can see up here, in predictability. In fact, it's really more of an indicator in a lot of cases that your business has grown, and as you can see in this first bullet here, it's matured. I remember when I started, it was kind of a do whatever for how much money will you give me? Okay, and then I would install something, and then I had to install it again, and I don't remember how I installed it last time. I mean, you guys have all been there the same way, whether it was a copy of Office or antivirus or who knows what, but it was just everything was a one-off. And so the sign of it being mature is where there's a lot of predictability, there's a lot of repeat processes where you know exactly how long it's going to take. I've got an example here on the right of just a bottler, something where you go through a mechanism here where the bottles eventually get filled and the caps get put on and the labels are rolled on and so on. And if you think about if this kind of environment had a lack of predictability, what would happen? And it's pretty simple. It's things like, like the bottles have to be in a very specific spot so they can get filled. And then the bottle caps have to be in a specific area in order to get picked up. And then when they get pushed down onto the top of the bottle after it's been filled, there has to be a certain amount of pressure applied and so on, right? So you think about if none of that exists in terms of predictability, you're going to end up with broken bottles that are half full, the label's on at the top, the bottom, it's upside down, it's on backwards, it's not on at all, and no bottler can go and say, here's my beer or whatever it is that they're selling, because it's not a consistent product. And the same kind of stands true here for you guys. And what I want you to be thinking about when we're talking about predictability, at least at this level, is we're really thinking about this from a standpoint that it's not just I have consistent environments, which is important. And we're going to talk about this a little bit here on this slide. It isn't just having a consistent environment like all the servers are named the same at all of my customers and all the workstations and everything's installed in the same folder. Those things are important. Yes, need to do that. However, that's not the predictability we're talking really about that's going to help your business grow. That's a sort of a foundational element. And I've got a couple of items that I'm going to put up here, and then Scott and Emma, I'd love for you guys to comment on any and all of them if we can here. I'm just going to I'm going to go and just put these up, I think is the best way to do this. And as you guys in the audience can see here, it's more than consistent environments. The idea here is if you have this predictability, you need to have predictability around, let's say, your hours needed, right? How much time do I need to have a certain type of service provided to a customer? How much revenue am I going to get out of providing that service? You want to start getting around, as you grow, things like how many issues a week am I going to have? How many is that per technician? The number of customers that you can even support based on the size of your organization. All of that is some of the predictability as well, and we're going to kind of roll this back in a minute or two after we talk about just this part, how this comes back to documented repeatable processes. But before we do that, Scott, Emma, just commentary on just overarching idea of having predictability in an MSP business.
Sure. Well, let me take that one. So initially, when I first started into the MSP world, we were more in a break-fix kind of mentality. There wasn't a whole lot of structure. Most things were done on paper or in OneNote or Excel, and we didn't have great applications to manage, the knowledge or to force predictability. Every technician was kind of doing their own thing in whatever their own comfort zone was. And the real problem with the outcome of that is that you end up with a very unpredictable result for the customer. More than anything, it seemed to be the biggest problem. We could handle the problems internally, although it certainly caused a lot of friction and wasted a lot of time. I think the biggest issue was that what the customer saw was not always a predictable result. So if they got technician A, the kind of level of service they were getting, the insight they were getting, the knowledge that technician had wasn't the same as technician B that showed up. And that was a symptom or an end result of us having poor process, poor predictability built into our own, day-to-day operations. Right at the very beginning, Nick, you talked about the, indications of a mature and professional MSP. You know, you really need to, as you mature your MSP, begin producing, you know, predictable processes for key situations. You know, if a main server goes down, what do we do? What is our reaction to that? What is our communication method for that? It can go as far as things like human resources, so sick days. When somebody's sick, you know, that person is probably integral to either our service delivery or a project. How do we handle that? What do we do in that case? People who are on call, if you start offering 24/7 services, you know, that you need a lot of predictability about what happens when I get called at 3 in the morning. Is it my job to go? Can I hand it off to somebody else? What is the communication to the customer? You know, any level of lack of predictability in that kind of service delivery ultimately shines very negatively on the organization, might result in major downtime for the customer, and ultimately will probably lose you a customer, which I definitely did in the early days. So when it comes to predictability, it kind of spans the entire customer experience all the way to inside my own organization through and through.
And what's interesting there is for you guys coming back full circle to kind of thinking about this in terms of documented, repeatable processes. In fact, you touched on them a little bit, Scott. You talked about even, you know, some processes I wasn't even thinking about, like HR. That's great. The service stuff, everyone's thinking about that, but no one's thinking about, hey, it's a Saturday at 3 and so is sick, so what do we do? But having that process, having some kind of predictability there, as you can see in this bullet that I put up here, as you grow and you add on more people, you know what you're going to do. You guys in the audience, you may even be an MSP of 1. But as you grow, you want to have that same level of predictability where you know it will be done consistently every time. And here's the key part. I put these bullets up above that, the hours needed, revenue generated, and so on up there, not just as a way of saying, hey, you need to have consistency there too, but actually to make the point that if we have documented, repeatable processes, then you're going to have consistency in how many hours do I need. You will know how much revenue you're going to generate. You'll have an idea because you are consistently implementing, you're consistently troubleshooting, and those kind of things. You'll know how many issues you're going to have a week, the number of customers, to some, some measure of error, of course, a margin of error. But the success that you're going to have as a business is found in predictability itself. So what I want to do here is, I think you started talking about some good examples, Scott. I think that's a great segue because you're diving already into some of the weeds, which I love, because I know these guys in the audience are definitely thinking in terms of the weeds. And by the way, again, if you guys have questions, you have a comment, stick those things in the Q&A box. Happy to include you in the conversation today. But the first place I want to start with is the idea that not everything has to be documented, because that could be kind of a downfall for you. And certainly when we're talking about you need to have consistency everywhere, you're thinking, do I have to document everything? Because that could be, you can go nuts there. That just gets ridiculous. And as a matter of fact, I've got here, even the fact that you can go overboard pretty easily. And one of the real big challenges here is if you do that, if you go overboard, I'm going to document every single thing, you tend to just simply complicate the business. You're not actually, in some ways you're helping, of course, because you do need to document that example Scott gave of when this main server goes down or one of the key servers goes down, yes. But if you start going really overboard, then what you're doing, you're simply adding a level of complication to the process itself, the overarching process of, great, I'm glad you solved the problem. Now stop what you're doing. Don't do anything else. First go document. And then now you're in some ways overcomplicating things.
Yeah, and Nick, I'm going to throw something in there. I feel like in a lot of the conversations we have around internal predictability, and Emma, I think you've probably seen this kind of thing as well in our client base, we forget the customer. The whole point is to deliver great service to a customer that we want to keep. And so we end up trying to mitigate that by throwing tons of process in, tons of documentation. We want to be as prepared as possible for that customer, and that's great, but having those layers and layers to go through from between the technician and helping the customer often results in worse service, not better. So one of the things I tried in my own organization and I found worked really well was not necessarily overcomplicating with process to get to the end result, but educating my team on what end result I wanted. So I would say to my team, my support team, our goal is to support that customer as best as possible. I want a desired outcome of, let's say my help desk tech. I'd like you ideally in a perfect world to be on the phone for less than 30 minutes, but when you hang up, I want the problem solved on a first call resolution basis of as minimally 80% of our calls, and I want a happy customer at the other side. I want high CSATs, and I want the ticket closed with at least some notes as to what you did so that if I have to refer back to it, I get it. So, okay, I've given him like 3 or 4 end goals that I want. None of them are in conflict with each other. None of them are overly, boxed in by process, but that employee of mine understands my goal to my customer is great service in as quick a time as possible with as few handoffs as possible. And if all my staff is thinking like that, then I'm not going to end up over-documenting. I'm not going to end up having to build walls of process, because all of that was just to get to that end goal. So as long as my staff is aware of that end goal, then we're going to have success at the other end.
That's a great point, Scott, just giving those guidelines to make sure that you get the outcomes that you want without necessarily overcomplicating the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned is just making sure the customer's happy in the long run. There's an element here, I put another bullet, I'm going to kind of use it to tie it in here, is when you're over-documenting, you're over-processing. I'm going to use that kind of out of context. You guys kind of know what I mean, where you're just creating way too many processes or over-processing to a degree. You create friction in a couple of facets, a couple of different ways. One is with the customer. The fact that if we're too busy documenting stuff, then we're not taking care of the customer, to your point earlier, Scott. I love that. But there's also some friction for you as a business owner when you think about if, Scott, you heard his a great example. I love how you gave that great example, Scott, because you're really talking about your own staff going, I'm not going to dictate to you exactly how it needs to be. Of course, you did dictate to some degree, but you're saying instead, I want you guys to keep your eyes on the prize and figure out what is it going to take to meet the goal. And if you don't do that, and you simply were, if you guys in the audience were to simply come up with I want a process of make sure you document absolutely everything, you end up causing friction with your own staff, between them and you, because they're grumbling, going, my stupid boss wants me to create these documents every time we do something, and it creates a friction there, because even they know, and their desire is kind of where Scott's head was with his team, which is they just want to service the client, make the client happy, and now they got to do these extra things because their boss asked for it. And so it creates friction, and it also creates inefficiencies just because that whole thing, just even think of the time. Where's the time being devoted? Documenting, not supporting the customer, documenting, so they have inefficiencies introduced.
Yeah, for sure. And, giving your staff the leeway to make those decisions and get that customer happy is a big deal. You have to trust in your staff. You have to trust in their ability to get that done. As long as you've been careful to communicate the goal that you want, and you're really sure you've done that, because I find a lot of people don't. That they kind of fall down on that. A couple of really good examples of where, those inefficiencies pop up: waiting for permission. If there's a case where you're not allowed to move ahead because you know the right answer, you can absolutely solve it. There's nothing more frustrating for, an IT individual to sit around waiting for the right person or the right service manager to come in and say it's okay to go ahead. Give them some permission and leeway and power to make those decisions for you and help that customer out right away, because speed, as we know in the IT service delivery world, is probably one of the biggest points that customers are looking for: fast turnaround, low downtime.
Absolutely.
So, get rid of that single point of failure. If you've got a single service manager and all the power rests in his or her hands and no one can make a move without them, identify that as a major stumbling block for delivering great service, and find ways to either pass that permission around or have multiple, people that you can go to. Another really good example, I think, is, you talked, Nick, about adding notes. And on our side, we obviously deal with notes day in, day out.
Yeah.
I think every organization deals with putting in, careful notes about what you want, how you want it done, or how you did it. And that's great. But a lot of the problem is that we tend to have too many places to put notes.
Yeah.
So many organizations don't focus on a single application or a great ticketing system or, whatever. They put it in OneNote. They put it in Excel. Passwords go in Excel. Customer info goes in OneNote. Some screenshots go in a shared drive. That information is so spread out that you spend, like you mentioned, Nick, half your time just entering these notes. But when you go to find them, they're not available, right?
And back to your point, Scott, about giving some guidelines on what those notes should say so that you don't have drastic differences in the way certain technicians are documenting things.
Yeah, having some kind of standardization around how things should be documented.
Yeah, what you want covered in your notes, right.
And, we used to have to go through a process of ticket audits, especially back at HP. I mean, you'd be going through on a regular basis, looking at tickets, grabbing people who clearly, hadn't quite got the concept of how to document what they did, and templating it to some degree, but not in a stringent way, but at least saying, I need to know, how the call started, what you did to solve it, and how it wrapped up, and whether or not there's more steps. And I need to know that in every ticket you touch.
That's the core information.
Exactly. And, just getting that kind of baseline out, that's the predictability we want. What I don't want to do is give my technicians a, 40-point template that they have to fill into every ticket. Because the result, I'm sure you've seen this before, right?
Yeah.
But they exist. They definitely, a lot of people fall into that trap. Well, I will force them to do it in this way, and then that way gets input from 50 different departments who want information, and that way becomes a beast of a ticket. No one's going to do it, and the end result is people don't do it. They will cut corners. They will just skip it and say they forgot. They will. I've found guys who haven't entered information in tickets for months, and they said, "Oh, I forgot." You forgot to enter it in 350 tickets, but that's what happens if you put up too many roadblocks and make it too difficult. Some people like following a process, but you're definitely going to have a lot of guys and girls that don't, and so those people will just get insanely frustrated if you over-process the situation.
Let me do this. Let me ask you guys in the audience, put it into the Q&A box just to respond to this kind of question for you guys, even though it's supposed to be the other way around. What is the biggest challenge you guys are having with documentation? We've got another slide and a half or so of content left that we want to kind of cover, but at the same time, I'd love to hear from you guys, what is the biggest challenge you have around trying to create these documented, repeatable processes? Because I love the vein of thinking that both you, Em and Scott, came up with, where you're thinking about, too many different places to put something in. You can imagine, I got the OneNote or the Excel spreadsheet, or that maybe it's in the ticket system or whatever, and it becomes an issue of where do you put it. Emma, your idea of just the concept of everyone putting in some consistent pieces of information. I love that thinking, because that goes back to even what Scott was saying earlier about here's the prize. That was my way of interpreting everything he said of let's make the customer happy. That's the goal. But at the same time, your comment around let's make sure there's at least some consistent information to help the next person who's going to have to work on that customer, or if you're sick or whatever the case is. That all kind of jives together. Bristol says, right, meaning write something correctly. And so I'm assuming here, and Bristol, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming the thought here is just kind of probably along the lines of what Emma was bringing up. Let's have the right pieces of information, write it correctly, put in enough detail. That becomes a little subjective. He's also got here legal and ethical guidelines is another issue here. Tom says the biggest challenge is probably updating. And he mentions IT Glue is a good place for documentation, but his issue is updating. So Scott, Emma, thoughts on even just that, on updating detail?
I think Emma touched on it really well earlier, is that, you don't want to overcomplicate the situation, but you need enough detail to be effective. And so, I have heard of products like IT Glue before, really helping out MSPs with that kind of thing. Basically, you want a centralized system that's accessible is kind of the challenge for that. So getting into things like Excel or OneNote or whatever, they're not secure. They're not easily accessible from the outside world. So you send a guy on site and, he has no idea who the primary contacts are probably. He doesn't know a lot about that environment just off the cuff. It's 4 a.m. He's half asleep anyway. He doesn't remember the password for the main admin. There's so many problems with not having a good centralized repository for that customer information. They rely on you to know that kind of stuff, and it really is up to you to find a solution to that and make it available. Products that give you a mobile device app or what have you are fantastic. Having a good RMM platform that somehow merges with them is great, so you have all your device and asset detail at your fingertips. We used to send technicians out. We'd end up with kind of a tech that knew environment A, B, and C, and those were kind of his or her environments. And inevitably, that tech would leave, that tech would be sick, and so we'd send a newbie out who doesn't know that environment too well. They're great tech, but they've never been there. And they would get on site and they would say things like, "Where's your server room?" And our customers would lose their mind because they'd say, "You've been servicing my environment for 5 years, you don't know where my servers are? I don't want you in here." And I get it. I totally empathize with them. We should know that. And so we do. That information just wasn't collected efficiently and shared efficiently. So it really makes a big difference that when you have a new site come on board, you document where things are, you document the accounts, and you put it all into a central location that even someone at 3 a.m. can get their hands on and figure out how to get in the server room and be effective there without any knowledge of the site whatsoever.
Yeah, it makes an interesting note there about the fact that they can't get their work done, and that actually kind of ties in to these last 3 bullets that I've kind of got on here that I want to just really quickly mention for you guys in the audience, and then I want to kind of get to the good stuff, which is, well, what should we be documenting and how we should do it and those kinds of things. In addition to this friction, the inefficiencies and all that, I want you to keep in mind that it does create that reduction, and you start getting down that path a little bit, Scott. There's a lack of productivity. People don't know where the server room is, great example, but it could also just be something as simple as, I don't know what folder we normally install this in, or where am I supposed to find this application, even where this data is. So there's a lack of productivity, and of course that impacts your business. You have a lack of then profitability in the same way, because you're paying your own people more time to get the same job done, and it also impacts their effectiveness. Back to your, I love that example, where's the server room? That person not being so effective, are they? Because they're just spending their time going, where do I go? Left, down this hall, down that hall? It's like one of those Scooby-Doo episodes where they're going through all the doors wondering. But
especially at night, if no one else is there and you're trying to get in the building and you don't know how to get in the building, you set off the alarms and now the cops are coming and you don't know the contact to call to get, to wave them off. You don't know where the server room is. The cops are asking our guy out front, why are you here? What do you, tell me about who owns this building. He barely knows anything other than the customer's name. That was in very early days when we made lots of mistakes. Yeah, you don't want to be there.
Yeah, totally agree. So let's do this. Let's actually jump in and talk about what should be documented. And while we're doing this, for you guys in the audience, would you just put in the Q&A box, tell us what you're focused on documenting right now, or if there's something where you really have a question about, how do I document this? Or how far should I document? Whatever it is that's in your mind as we start talking about what should be documented. And we've got kind of a long bullet list here and some discussion points we're gonna cover here. But I'd love to hear from you guys. What is it that you are documenting today? You can share with your peers, and that way they kind of get a sense of what you're doing. And at the same time, if you really have a question like, I'm not sure, should we be documenting this? Is there, how detailed should we go into? Whatever it is, put that in the Q&A box. Just stick it right in there, and I'll make sure that we include you in the conversation today. And so I think you actually hit it on the head, Scott, that you're 2 slides too early, or whatever the case is, which is absolutely fine. But it's kind of like starting at the high level, and you work towards a detail. And you actually said that. You kind of said, let's take care of the customer. That's the goal, and then work backwards from there. And I know for you guys in the audience, this seems rather simplistic, and I get it. But I think this is one of those things where, again, I want you to think about the problem and just focus in with us on this problem. And we have to start at the highest level here, thinking about that issue around the consistency. And you notice that I didn't put predictability here. I put productivity. And I did that on purpose here because the goal was, if they're productive and they're consistent in the way they're doing things, in my mind, I wrote this slide that way thinking the customer is going to be happy because they're getting the job done. They're getting the job done the same way. Your example, where's your server room? Well, think on the other end of that. The new person comes in, knows where the server room is. There's consistency in the service and the execution overall, even at a high level. And the person is productive in getting the work done. They fixed the problem. They were in and out in 5 minutes, and it's a person that's never been here. Wow, you guys are awesome. Instead of your other end of that spectrum, which was, what was that, never come back, or would you say, get out of here? We've been having you guys for 5 years, or whatever you said, right? Yeah. So thoughts on that, Scott? Emma, I'm going to stop right there first off. Any thoughts there?
Well, so starting how, so, I think we talked a little bit about going with the big picture, which is, of course, customer satisfaction, maintaining and retaining those customers. But you do need a certain level of minutia when it comes to the customer environment. It's important to understand the environment, what we're servicing, what we're not servicing, who our main contacts are, what our billing cadence is, their basic procedures around backup, AV, or patch. Someone here mentioned, what are standardizations around that. I'll speak to that in a second. But that kind of stuff does need to be documented. It does need to be visible. When you get into the minutia, if you have a great system to capture all that stuff, fantastic. I think the real important things are, how are we servicing them, and in what kind of cadence are they expecting that servicing? So, last week, Nick, we did, or a couple weeks ago, we had a conversation about SLAs. And, that kind of information is important. How quickly, from our perspective, from our help desk perspective, how quickly do we have to get to their tickets? Who do we need to contact, and how do we escalate those tickets as we go forward? That's all really important for us to have, so that we don't treat everybody as a Tier 1 emergency fire. We want to understand how we treat that particular environment. From the customer side, though, it's really important to make them understand how they interact with us and the speed at which we respond to things, because if you don't inform them of that information, they basically, or educate their user base on that information, they assume everything is a priority 1 emergency. So, you know, as far as documentation, we want to make sure we provide them with some form of documentation or accessibility to how we're going to service them, when we're going to service them, and the things that are covered under their agreement, and the things that might cost money, because often you'll get into a tailspin of them asking every time they call, will this cost money? Do we owe you for this? And they really should know that right up front, and there shouldn't be that gray area or that confusion. So start at the big stuff. How much do things cost, and how do we service that environment? And then work your way down to the details. And honestly, a great RMM platform like RMM or N-Central, and mated with a good ticketing system, takes care of most of that minutia. What are the devices? What's on those devices? What assets are in the environment? What software are they running? You know, all that can be kind of covered off automatically, or automagically, as I like to say, in a good piece of software. You shouldn't have to write all that down.
No, that's good. Let me do this. I've got a number of different bullets, and I think the best way we can probably address this for the audience, because I did see the same question coming in as well, is I just want to kind of put these all out here for you guys in the audience to think about this. And we're going to talk about this sort of maybe generically. And what I've done here is I built this list just kind of thinking about that high level, working towards the detail, and I started going down, well, I'd start with standards, right? You do want to have those standards around how do we name our servers, what's our IP addressing scheme, you know, whatever do we name workstations, whatever that stuff is, domains. Go ahead, yeah, that's got to get done. I'm not trying to dismiss it like it's not important. It is important, but that's the stuff that gets done once. It's not the stuff that gets done every day. Right, so it becomes kind of less important to the technicians because they aren't going to use it as often, but you need to have that somewhere. Business processes, you started talking about that a little bit, Scott, even way back at the beginning of our conversation today, around how do we do things in the business. That's probably the second thing that came to mind for me, because I'm thinking about, let's say a new technician comes in. You might have someone who's technically absolutely phenomenal. They can hit the ground running. You just say, our servers are named server 1 through 5 at every location or whatever, and okay, great, they'll hit the ground running there, but they also need to know in order for them to be productive, be efficient, and then, of course, to be profitable on your end of things, you'd want to have business processes there. Configurations are a big one, especially around what do these customers need, and I think that ties in with services because not every customer may have the same. For example, I've got security settings here. You might have a default set of security settings that are OS-based, let's say even a copy of Windows Defender, but then you might have a service that you're offering that takes security a bit deeper, where now it's things like, well, we do email scanning and we actually put an extra agent on and that it connects into Outlook or whatever it is. And so those things can change based on the services as well. And then you mentioned SLAs. I love that. That's kind of fits in the fourth bullet here, Scott, just thinking about how we resolve problems. When do we resolve problems? How fast do we need to resolve problems? And then I have this, you can keep going because it really kind of depends on your own business. But Scott, Emma, thoughts on any and all of this?
Well, so
go ahead.
I see Emma's got something on her mind. I was just going to say, with regards to naming and that kind of thing, the problem I see most people fall into is one person sits down and comes up with a naming convention, if anyone comes up with one at all, but one person might go and do that. And inside, you know, speaking from someone who works at producing an RMM platform, you can name your devices, you can, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I've seen hundreds of different naming conventions. But the biggest problem with that kind of stuff is people do get kind of mired in the minutia, and they do get kind of blinders on, and one person produces a naming convention without involving anyone else who uses the system or services the devices. And so then you end up with a naming convention that works for one person but not for everybody. So, you know, we're talking about standards and that kind of thing here a little bit. And it's important that when you're creating these kinds of things that you involve anyone who might, well, at least a core stakeholders group of people who are going to be using this system. Get their input so that when you do produce something, it's something you don't have to change 2 weeks from now. Because ideally, like you said, Nick, you want to do it once and do it right and not have to do it again and again and again. What I see is people doing it over and over and over again because, oops, you know, we really needed to also mention that, you know, in the name I want to put what the OS is on it, let's say, or maybe the section of the building that it's in or what have you. And so they keep revisiting it, which means a lot of wasted time going back and renaming a bunch of things, sometimes thousands of devices. So if you're going to produce standards, which I highly recommend you do, especially as you mature and bring on more and more clients, definitely helps. But think carefully about what you build first. Try and get a few people in the room rather than just leave one guy to do it, and you'll end up with a better result. And that kind of goes for everything as far as documentation is concerned. Decide as a team what is necessary to do the job and then document that stuff. Don't just document a bunch of stuff you don't need, and don't design something in a vacuum because it ultimately will not fit everybody's requirements.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going to go, is that, you know, these are group decisions that can be made so that it works best for everyone. They can be works in progress, and you can revisit whether they're working as intended or if you need to revisit them.
Yeah, and you know, the biggest problem with processes tends to be, again, one person designs them and then tries to push them on everybody else, or simply doesn't communicate them, or just sends out a template in an email and says, here's the process, we're going to fill out this template every time. From what I've seen, that typically fails because a few people say, I don't like process, I'm not doing it, because they don't understand the impact it has to the business, they don't understand the end goal, it just looks like more work to them. You really want to build these processes or these, you know, whatever standards or processes you're creating with a group, get investment from that group, and then train it to your staff. Actually sit them down and say, okay, we're doing this because, and again, tie it to that end goal. We want customer happiness, we want speed, efficiency, so we're doing this because it solves these 3 or 4 problems in this way. Here's how we're going to do it. We as a team have decided to do it this way. We need buy-in from everybody. We will be auditing to make sure that everybody's on board. You know, there's got to be some kind of follow-up to it. Otherwise, you're going to send it a template, no one's going to follow it, or a few people will haphazardly follow it, and it just creates more clutter that you're going to have to go back and clean up, which nobody wants to do.
That's a good point. That's just letting the people understand what the goal is, why it needs to be done. And a lot of times, this is me as sort of the marketer in me, is help them understand why it benefits them. So you do get that buy-in because they understand if you guys spend the extra 2 minutes here documenting this, that, and the other thing, then you know, you'll actually save yourself, and if everyone else does it too, you'll end up saving yourself 15 minutes, an hour, or whatever it is. Oh, okay, I can do that. So let's do this, though. Jesse's got a question here, and we're like well past the 30 minutes here. We're at 35, 36 minutes past the hour. I have to look at my clock again. But he mentioned this is also I want to pose to you guys in the audience at the same time as we kind of answer this. He's saying he's looking to see how people document technology standards, and the 2 examples that he gives are standards for backups and email security. Now, this isn't just about backups and email security, just his examples, but I'm curious for you guys in the audience, what are you doing as far as that documentation? And while we're waiting for maybe some of those answers to come in, if any do at all, Scott, Emma, let's actually just kind of go through this. I know when I think about the technology standards, it becomes kind of difficult in some ways to say, okay, here's how we're going to design our email security because is it these, you know, do we take screenshots and put check boxes to make sure it's configured a certain way? Do we have an image for a server that becomes the server and you're dropping it in? You know, there's a lot of different sort of, I'll put it this way, a lot of different implementation methodologies that are possible. Not, you know, an infinite number. There's a finite small number, but there's still a number of ways, and not every MSP is the same way. You know, but even maybe Emma, you're on your end, maybe you're thinking more from a marketing standpoint, a PMM standpoint. Scott, just thinking back to your older days doing this work, how would you see someone would implement, let's say, even something like either backup standards or email security, or how would you have them document that?
Well, so ideally, you're going to sit down as a team and come up with, you know, not all backup fits all people, right? In the technology environment, you probably are offering packages of a couple of different kinds of backup for servers or for workstations or for what have you. So ideally, you're going to sit down with probably your senior techs, and you're going to come up with a strategy in that you deploy backup into certain types of environments, and this is kind of your baseline for how you do it. So in my case, we didn't document exactly how every nut and bolt went together. We documented the outcome that we wanted. So, you know, we want a full on-site backup in 2 different places, and we want 1 cloud backup for off-site, you know, requirements. So that is the end goal that we want. And as far as this customer is concerned, they want to be able to restore within 1 hour. So we may need a virtual standby. So the customer requirements kind of help us plug in the kind of configuration modules we're going to use. And then as a team, we kind of decided, well, that means we're going to use these kinds of products. We're going to set them up in these kinds of ways using this data center and, you know, this kind of connection. And as a baseline, they need this kind of DSL line or what have you. So, I mean, we kind of had the basics of a baseline set up. And that is, you at least need to have that sorted out. And that way, when you go into a new environment, your salespeople know what they're pitching, you know what you're installing, you're familiar with the equipment, and back to the salesperson thing, you have a good pitch. You can take these standards you've created and wrap them into a pitch to a customer and say, when we come in, we have a standard we like to take our customers to, and we take them here because of X, Y, and Z. It's safer, it's more secure, it's faster, it's less downtime, et cetera. And your standards support that sale. And so now you look like you have your act together, you have a very clearly defined set of requirements, a clearly defined set of hardware that's necessary or software that's necessary, kind of streamlines that process. It also means that more likely than not, the customer is going to accept what I'm trying to tell them, rather than me coming in and saying, what do you need for backup? Okay, well, we've got lots of products that could do that. Does it need to be fast, and not having any particular requirement around fast? I'm just throwing the word fast out there. The customer doesn't really know what I'm asking. They don't really know what I'm providing. They don't really see a level of maturity in me that I'm trying to portray here. So if you can sit down and kind of map out your standards for AV backup, patch management, ideally, and you might have one or two different sets of standards. Patch, they might be those kind of people that just want everything patched all the time. Or they might be one of those environments that want patches deployed to a certain test group and then to another group. There's probably 2 or 3 tiers of the requirements you're likely to run into. Yeah. And Emma, I think you see that in your customers too.
Yeah, I was going to say it's all about offering that seamless, consistent customer experience, so you know that any tech or salesperson that's going out has the same packages that they're talking about, the same points, so the same pitch.
Exactly.
Right.
And because it's predictable, you can tell me environment A has patch package A, backup package B, and AV package 1. And cool, my tech knows what that is. Rather than coming into every customer environment as a tech and going, so what do we have here again? Okay, we've got AV with what? Okay, do they have a firewall? No fire. Like the list of possible configuration items are so long that you never really know what you're walking into. Yeah. And I found that a lot. My techs were confused by every new environment that we shuffled them to. So having a set package of well-documented processes or standards really helps kind of alleviate that problem if you can get to that point.
Absolutely.
And I think what's interesting here, you're almost on the cusp of saying this. I'm just going to go ahead and push you over the cliff and
do it.
And as you think about, you're talking about, let's say, backups, and then you mentioned, hey, the salespeople should be thinking about what it is that you're offering and so on. Back to Jesse's question, Jesse, is that just using the example you gave of, let's say, standards for backups are supposed to use. I think that you would tie that and document whatever the platform, if you're using Max Backup from Enable, from SolarWinds MSP, sorry, everyone's bought everybody now and I've forgotten, I'm sorry, SolarWinds MSP, and if that's what you're using or some other solution, you think about the service that you're offering, and then you probably have a standard set of configurations. So the server, you might have tiers of backups. You might say, we provide backups of all critical servers, 5 servers or less. I'm making this up as I go along. And that's your good offering. And then your better offering is 5 servers and 3 workstations, and we provide a certain SLA that's, let's say it's 24 hours. I'm making this all up as I go along again. And then that's good, that's better. And then they have best. And best is we cover everything and we have a 4-hour SLA or whatever. And so you think about, from that standpoint, the service actually defines what you need to document, because documentation is all about the exceptions. Now, the exceptions might be exceptions that apply to everyone. Like if someone only has good or has better or has best, you might have 3 different ways to configure your backups. The good may not get hybrid cloud. Maybe they only get on-prem. But then the better and the best get hybrid cloud, and the best people just get a better SLA or whatever it is. But the idea is that ends up dictating, what does that look like? How is better different from good? How is best different from better? And you put those pieces of documentation in. And it might be back to my earlier example of it's screenshots and a couple of checkboxes. When we set up Max Backup, I'm just going to stick with that because I happen to know the product really well. That we're going to go and we're going to make sure that we're doing backups of these specific servers, because you always have your servers named the same way, and we're going to make sure that we have, let's say, a 1 backup a month that automatically archives beyond 30 days, and that way we have an old copy of it just in case for ransomware or whatever. These kind of things, and you just simply document the checkboxes that apply to the good, better, and best offering. So I hope that kind of helps. I didn't get any other answers from anyone else in the audience, unfortunately, but I hope, Jesse, that it actually does help a little bit. And then we're kind of at the end of our time here, so I'm just going to put this out for you guys. Do you have any questions here? And while we're doing that, we're going to wait, see if you guys have a question or two. We'll wait another minute or so. But while we're doing that, Scott, Emma, any final thoughts just kind of wrapping up anything that we've said? I'm putting you guys on the spot here a little bit, but just thoughts of anything else to kind of finish up what we've been talking about today?
Well, I'll sort of wrap up from my end and say, I've said it several times here, but I want to reiterate it. Communication of the standardization that you've created is really important. So don't be the service manager or CEO or head tech that sits in your office and creates all these processes and standardizations and then just either emails them out or even worse, doesn't send them out at all. Make sure that your team understands why these are important, why you've put them in place, the goal you're trying to get them to. That's really important. And so they understand why you've spent all this time generating this stuff, and make sure you get input on it so they feel like they're a part of it rather than just being subjected to it. Because being subjected to process coming down the line and being dropped on you is never any fun. Nobody likes it. Everybody immediately rebels against it. And so you're going to create friction where you're really trying to create efficiency. Make sure that that information is also communicated to your customer so they understand what processes you've got in place and they know what the expected result of things are. Now that means they may call you on it if you don't follow your process, but that's okay. I mean, it's better that you alleviate the gray area between you and your customer with solid process than it is to be called on one that maybe you missed. So use it to keep everybody on the straight and narrow, create efficiency going in both directions, and just mutual understanding in both directions.
Yeah, I'll just echo that you want that seamless customer experience, the communication wide open between both your internal and external folks, and, just like letting everybody have a stake in the processes is going to help it go over a lot better.
Absolutely.
And just to add on to that, to kind of sum things up here, the goal overarching, again, is to create predictability. Predictability creates profitability. It creates productivity, creates efficiencies, and getting that buy-in, creating those processes, communicating those to the customer, communicating those to the team members that are participating in them and so on, all creates that predictability so that your business starts working like that fine-oiled machine, that bottler that it slides over, you install the server. The cap comes down, you put in security, or whatever it is, and you end up having less problems, more profit. That's the goal. So that's what we're really trying to get across today. It looks like we don't have any questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just kind of put this thank you up here. You've got a URL here in case you got any more questions. You can go take a look at some of the products from SolarWinds MSP. And I guess I'm going to stop here by saying thank you, Scott, Emma. Thank you both, guys. You had great input. Thank you for your content today. I think that really helped the audience a lot.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you. And on behalf of Scott, Emma, and myself, Nick Cavalanci, I want to thank you guys in the audience for participating today. Hope it was helpful. Hope it was educational. And we'll catch you on the next webinar.